Once upon a time, in the distant, far-off days, when childhood had not yet been invented, life for children and life for adults was much the same thing. Now, this is a story of how childhood came to be invented. Invented. I can hear you thinking about it already. What is he talking about? No childhood indeed? Well, today, the business of being a child is different from the business of being an adult. It wasn't always the case. It's almost as if we had manufactured childhood. A whole world, especially for children, has now been created. Special things called toys.
Yes, it is. Louis Stewart.
Special competitions. Special television programs. Special children's parties. Special clubs. Special places called school, with special work called education. A whole host of special places, events, and things.
What do we do with grams and kilograms?
Sugar and spice and all things nice.
We've become so used to the idea of children and childhood that we can hardly tell them apart anymore. There always have been children. But childhood, the idea of a special age for going to school, for not taking responsibility, for playing rather than working, all that is one of these newfangled modern inventions. Let's hear what Professor Worsley and Mr. Berger have to say about this extraordinary state of affairs.
Childhood, a sort of concept of a phase of existence which is quite separate from and different from the adult world, and probably and inferior and preliminary to the adult world. That's a pretty recent sort of idea. It's as recent as modern industrial society.
In the middle of the 19th century, childhood is invented, and this is reflected in painting, or paintings of children. They begin to look differently, these children, in two ways. We actually see them differently. They look out at us differently.
Most of the children alive in the world today would be amazed if they could see the sort of fancy childhood our children get. For them, just as for the children in Britain centuries ago, being a child means leading the same life as their parents. Peter Worsley has made a special study of societies we call primitive.
Well, I lived with Australian Aborigines, and there the children go out with their parents in the bush looking for wild products, yams or fishing, and the boys and the girls will go out with the families, and the girls will do what their mothers do, and the boys will do what their fathers do. They're not as good at it, they're not as competent, but they will contribute and imitate, and they're really being little adults.
Childhood, then, is something very special to our society. Let's go back to the beginnings of things, to the times we now call the Middle Ages. The people lived in villages, rich men in castles. Beyond the castles were the fields, beyond them the wild woods, then the barbarians, the pagans, the uncharted seas, and worse. And if you went too far, which nobody did, of course, you would have fallen off the edge, because as everybody knows, the world was flat in those days, suspended like a plate between heaven and hell. These were boisterous and turbulent times of chivalry, knights, warring barons, and crusades. God ruled over the king over lords, lords over people, husbands over wives, and husbands and wives together over children. Everybody worked. Remember also that there was very little privacy in those days. People shared the same big room, so no one ever said, not in front of the children, dear. Children knew all about such things as sex, death, and politics. Remember also that most babies that were born died. Let's ask Peter Burke how parents looked on their children. He's made a special study of children in history.
Fundamentally, I think, they think before about 7, a child is more or less like an animal. They compare children very often to monkeys. I mean, they may think of them as very pleasant animals, rather nice to pet. They may think of them as somewhat vicious animals whose wills have to be broken, but it's an animal nevertheless. As soon as they stop being animals at the age of reason, when they can talk and make moral judgments, they're thought of as miniature adults. If he was a peasant child, it would be about 7 that he'd be working in the fields. It's about 7 when a noble child might be trained to hunt, ride a horse, fight. And I think that if we were to meet a medieval child today, we would be enormously surprised, maybe even shocked, by its sophistication. That a child would know its way about the world, would know how to make a living, would know which adults to trust and not to trust, would be aware of sexual matters.
Look again at those pictures. Are these small figures children or servants? If they're children, they have decidedly grown-up faces. John Berger is good at deciphering clues from pictures.
Well, I think that the paintings from the past are in fact one of the only ways that we can now tell how people looked at things, how people saw things. If you take a painting like that by Bruegel, which is a painting about playing games, some of the groups are made up of children, some are of adults, but they are all very similar. They wear the same sort of clothes, and you have the feeling that the children and the adults are big and small versions of the same thing. They are not different things.
And that's how it was for centuries. Meanwhile, history was happening.
History, as everybody knows, began in 1066 at Hastings when Harold got an eye full of arrow. Copernicus discovered that the Earth was going round the sun. Being right, hardly anybody believed him. Columbus discovered America, though he thought it was India and called it the West Indies. England conquered Ireland, and the Troubles began.
Get out of it! Come on, bloody!
Unspeakable things were happening in the Tower of London. And of course, there were battles. The battles of Bannockburn, Cressy, Shrewsbury, Agincourt, Tewkesbury, Naseby.
Well, that was history, and we have emerged somewhere in the 17th century. Let's first find out what has been happening to children through the world of painting.
Now later, children appear in another kind of painting. This is towards the end of the 17th century, when you have formal family portraits. I mean, if you look at the children there, they are dressed rather like their parents. They have the same kind of expression in their eyes as their parents. They are actually looking out on the same world with the same kind of attitude to what they can see. And they stand there exactly really like their parents. They are kind of substitutes, mannequin substitutes for their parents.
All that applies to the child of 6 or 7 and over. Of course, it does not apply to babies and infants. They were swaddled. And at a symbolic level, that practice was right in line with her ideas on shaping up the undeveloped adult, molding, controlling, and disciplining. Young children, being not reasonable, as they said, could only be governed by fear, so they beat them.
Ow! Ow! Oh! Oh!
These attitudes would horrify child psychologists of today, but that is how the English brought up young children for centuries. Time for a little more history, perhaps?
With true British panache, Drake played bowls. And put the Armada to flight. Newton discovered the laws of motion and the law of gravity. London had its problems. First a plague, and then a fire. In Ireland, there was more trouble.
Get up, Edward, potato patch!
Queens, princes and lords went to the Tower where unspeakable things were still happening.
Off with his head.
And battles became so serious that they decided to call them wars. The Civil War, the 30 Years' War, the War of Jenkins' Ear, the War of...
We have now arrived at the end of the 18th century to find the world of ideas is on the boil. Writers like Rousseau are saying that people are born free, but enslaved by kings. That mankind is naturally good, but corrupted by society. Change society, they argued, and mankind will again become free. And in France, the ferment boiled over into a full-scale revolution. All this affected children too. If it was society that corrupted and brutalized the grown-ups, children who had not been in the world long enough to become corrupted remained innocent and free. Children were no longer unreasonable brutes, but innocence itself. Nobody actually proclaimed the new childhood in the same way they shouted the slogans like liberty, equality, fraternity. But there is a sudden flood of small changes, each by itself insignificant. But together, well, let's see. Patrick Murray is the curator of the world's first museum of childhood.
Children's life exploded. And they developed, a whole new culture was developed for them. Printing culture was developed for them, a toy culture, an entertainment culture, a social culture.
I think maybe at a more profound level, swaddling was even symbolic of the attitude of adults in that society to the child. The child is seen as a being that needs to be shaped and needs to be controlled. I think it's very interesting that a vocal attack on swaddling comes in Western Europe only in the middle of the 18th century, So I think there's a profound revolution in adult ideas of the child taking place at that time, and the attack on swaddling is just part of this.
The whole concept of toys and dolls was new. The very word doll itself, the very word toy, are both 18th century words. They mean quite different things before that. A toy usually meant a shoe buckle, a ring, a bit of nonsense.
The change in discipline maybe came rather more slowly. All the way through, in the Middle Ages, in the 16th century, in the 17th, in the 18th, adults rely on the whip or the stick. There are protests against this, and they get more vocal, more common in the later 18th century. So I think, yes, a dislike for beating children, that is part of the revolutionary discovery of childhood.
Children had always worn costumes rather like their adults, scaled down, but towards the end, the 1760s, 1770s, you got Marie Antoinette moved in, and she introduced the idea of air getting at children's bodies. The loose clothing, the wide neck. Now this is an entirely new thing.
People are actually looking at children differently. In other words, when they look at children, they are seeing something different from the way they saw them before. This is quite clear, for example, in Gainsborough's painting of his own daughters. When he looks at those two girls, he is no longer, as he would have been 100 years previously, really seeing two women to be. They begin to differ from grown-ups because they appear to be freer, to be less constrained. They have a much easier, more relaxed, playful relation to nature, to the landscape around them, or to the butterfly that they are playing with. They are less formal than their parents would be. They begin to have a kind of freedom, and they relate, I think, to nature, which is very much connected with the whole sort of movement of ideas, which in the end were expressed by Rousseau. The idea that man, in his natural state, before he is civilized, is in a sense noble, and that in a way civilization is a form of corruption. Now this was a historical idea of Rousseau's, but it was applied to children, so that children were thought of as beginning to be thought of as being more natural than adults.
Did you see that? Childhood has been invented. Let's catch up on history.
Nelson was kissed, first by Lady Hamilton, and later by Hardy.
Hello, sailor.
Stevenson invented the railway train, and Sir Robert Peel the police. Queen Victoria ruled over a quarter of the globe, which was fine for the British. Unspeakable things no longer happened in the Tower. It was now a menagerie. In Ireland, there was more trouble. And of course, there were wars. The Napoleonic Wars, the American War of Independence, the Opium War, the Indian War.
At any rate, that's what they taught us at school. And it brings us to that later part of the 19th century. But we want to find out what was happening to children. Paintings again.
Now, in the middle of the 19th century, this invention of childhood begins to be apparent in the paintings of children. If you compare a painting like this with the painting of Gainsborough, you see how that development, which was beginning then, has now advanced a long way. Those three children are not like adults. They are a special thing in themselves. They're looking out with what was then called a childish expression. That expression was meant to convey the fact and the idea of innocence. And the expression they have on their faces is no longer really the expression in which they might look at each other, the expression they might have when playing with each other. This is a special look addressed to us across a kind of frontier to where we are and where eventually they will be when they grow older. This notion of childhood being something separate is, I think, very closely connected with disillusion, actually. It is when a large number of people find their adult lives, even though they may not be fully consciously aware of it, extremely constrained, extremely unfree, that it is then necessary, as it were, for them to invent this freedom of childhood in their own past and to find some kind of consolation for it around them in their own children or in other people's children.